Creation, Book of Portals, Chapter 9. She opened her eyes. This time, she saw no walls, no lights, no sky. Instead, she saw a blank expanse of white extending on every side of her. She sat up. Underneath her was a circular white platform. Beyond the platform was an expanse of static gray matter. It reminded her of the white noise that appeared when a TV channel couldn't get a signal. But instead of hearing the fuzzy vibration of television static, she heard the ocean. She heard waves crashing around her. But as she looked around, there were no waves. There was no ocean. As she looked at her body, she saw she was wearing nothing. The anura in the clothing she had been wearing over it was removed. She pulled herself up from the platform. As she stood up, it seemed as if the blank space around her grew louder and brighter. The white was blinding again, but she didn't squint. She was somehow comforted by the purity of the light that expanded beyond her. She looked beneath her at the platform. It was smooth and shiny. It had tiny hexagonal shapes etched into the surface. It reminded her of honeycomb. She reached down to feel the surface of the platform. She couldn't feel anything. Her fingers were numb. But it wasn't the kind of numb where you could tell sensation was once there. It was a numb that felt as if there were never any nerve endings in her body at all. She touched her body, her arms, her legs, her hair. Nothing. Even the pressure from the weight of her hands was absent. She tried to speak. Her vocal cords seized, strained, and empty. She looked at her hands again. Her eyesight was just fine, but the rest of her senses were compromised. She bent down again, this time to feel along the edge of the platform. Still, no sensation. As she reached the edge, she peered over the side at the expanse of the staticky sea. White noise dots speckled as far as the eye could see. She reached down into the static abyss. As her fingertips touched the surface of the white noise ocean, a painful shock surged through her body. Suddenly, an alarm went off. A blaring, menacing noise that pierced through the lull of the ocean waves. Recoiling from the pain and sound, she looked around her. The white expanse had turned into brick walls, but instead of rectangular bricks, they were hexagons. And she watched as the white expanse around her turned into honeycomb-bricked barriers. Above her now was a six-sided ceiling that formed into a sharp-pointed tower. The point of the tower opened, and the alarm abruptly stopped, while the echoing sound still rang in her ears. As she focused on the open ceiling, she saw it. A red substance seeping through, down the sides of the tower. The static sea became unruly. What was once calm white noise energy turned into sharp spikes that rose high above her head. The red substance continued flowing down the walls, thick and dark, coloring the black and white static. A red sea spread out around her. The substance smelled heavily of iron. The realization hit her and turned her cold. It was blood. Suddenly, she heard the screams. Echoes and echoes of screams came from every direction. Accompanying the screams were sounds of retching, crying, groaning, and whimpers. The sounds ricocheted off the walls. As this happened, Bones and mounds of flesh began falling from the opening in the ceiling, tumbling onto her platform. A rotted, disembodied head fell at her feet, graying brain matter splattering all over her. And as she fell backward trying to get away, an eye fell into her lap. She let out a scream. No sound was heard over the agonized wailings around her. Then, as she slipped on a platform that was now covered in blood, a voice spoke out, drowning out all the others.
I didn't see anything, I promise.
It was her voice, but it didn't come from her body. It echoed around the walls over and over again.
I didn't see anything, I promise.
As her voice repeated this statement, the other voices died down. The corpses that had been scattered around her began to collect themselves and float back up into the opening. The blood that had dripped down from the wall staining the static sea followed suit, slowly pulling back up into the tower, draining the red from the white and black sea. Spike by spike, the sea settled until it was back to the calming stillness it was before. The walls disappeared into the expanse. The ocean sounds came back. She looked down at herself. She was completely clean.
I didn't see anything, I promise.
The voice was a pained whisper now. All at once, the strength in her body had been drained from her, causing her to collapse onto the platform. She felt as if she were falling in slow motion. And as her body fell, a circle opened up in the platform beneath her, forming into a portal. She fell through it, slowly drifting into unconsciousness again. When she awoke, she was in her bed again. She felt a slight burning sensation in her eyes as she sat up, looking around her. What had happened? Her wrists and ankles were sore. She noticed a tablet next to her and her sketchbook filled with random drawings from her time in Narleo. She looked at the page the sketchbook was open to. It was a drawing of the wristband. Oh, right. She remembered. She must have fallen asleep coming up with a design to upgrade it. But something else felt off. She gazed around her, looking closely at her surroundings this time. Her chrome shelf was in a corner which held the holographic collections of food and art books she borrowed from the library. A small circular table was next to it, coupled with a gray chair that she would read at. Her wardrobe, where she would keep her belongings, if she had any, was on the other side of the room. It was usually kept empty aside from a few pair of jumpsuits. Everything was in the right place, but something felt off. She moved from her bed and stood up. As she got up, she stumbled a bit, tripping over her shoes on the floor. She looked down. Her shoes were nowhere near her. They were actually in the corner, next to her shelf. There was nothing on the floor for her to trip over. She continued to walk, her ankles still sore. She looked down at them. There was nothing there, nothing attached to her ankles. Continuing, she made her way to the wardrobe. She was reaching out to slide it open when she felt it. A presence behind her. She wasn't alone in the room. She peered around again, making a point to purposely notice how everything was exactly where it should be. Everything is fine. I'm just tired, she assured herself. She cleared her mind. She turned back to the wardrobe, sliding it open. Immediately, she felt a gust of wind emanating from inside. In the back of the wardrobe was a portal. For what felt like the first time in ages, she saw her childhood home. Rather, it was the backyard. She saw her uncle as he gathered around with his friends, a somber but delighted meeting. He looked different. healthier, like he had been eating. His eyes were alive, like he was mentally present. She didn't remember when she last saw him like that, if ever. She wondered how long it had been in human time. She watched as her uncle sat around a table playing cards with his buddies. His eyes were squinted like they did when he was concentrating. She could see him speaking, but she couldn't make out what he was saying. The other men at the table turned to look at him. They had all been silent just moments before. Whatever he said, the statement seemed to come out of nowhere. One of the men, Ben, who still worked for NASA, reached his hand out to her uncle's shoulder, petting it and nodding at him as if in reassurance. Her uncle nodded back before looking down at the table. Then, after a few seconds, he turned his head toward the portal. He stared straight at her, into her eyes. She remembered how he looked when he was on the news months ago. It was the same kind of look, but this time, his eyes were tearing up. He was about to cry. She had a sinking feeling sprout from deep within her chest. She slowly slid the wardrobe closed as her uncle continued to stare in her direction. Strong emotions welled up inside her as a realization she wasn't fully yet ready to acknowledge began to bubble up. She lied back down on her bed, and as tears started to form, she felt the presence near her again. This time, it reached out and touched her. She was zapped awake. This time, she was in a lab with Kaidos. She looked around confused. She searched her memory for the last thing she did, but she came up blank.
You fell asleep,
Kaidos said evenly. Asleep? She suddenly didn't remember the last time she was awake.
You came here because you had a new idea. For the wristband, you said you wanted to show me something.
Suddenly, a memory of her rushing from the library to meet up with Kaidos came flashing back in her mind. Right. Collecting her thoughts, she flipped through the sketchbook that was in front of her. All of the pages were blank. That couldn't be right. She distinctly remembered covering the pages with dozens of sketches, many of them brand new. But all the pages were empty. She closed the sketchbook, which turned holographic again. She opened it back up. Still blank. She closed the sketchbook, tossing it toward Kaidos. This isn't my notebook. There are no sketches in it.
Look again.
Kaidos passed the book back to her. She opened it. The pages were no longer blank, but it wasn't covered in her drawings either. Instead, they were covered with drawings of her. One with her arms and ankles strapped to a table, one with a knife at her throat, one with her chest cut open, one with a light being extracted from her body. She slammed the book closed and threw it. She looked at Kaidos in horror, but Kaidos was no longer there. No one was there. She was alone. The lights in the facility disappeared, leaving her in darkness. Where did the orbs go? It was increasingly difficult to see in the blackness. She thought she could make out a figure in the distance.
Have you always been afraid of the dark?
A voice asked. It came from behind her. She turned around to face it. She stopped. She realized she could hear this voice. It wasn't in her head. But how? She suddenly felt a strong surge of heat coming from her right side. She turned to see the bright orange light from a portal. Fire was raging from the other side. She wondered if this was the sun from the other day, the one from the Feriton galaxy. She stepped toward it, the light offering a bit of comfort. As she loomed closer, she was pushed through the portal and into the sun. The fire didn't hurt in the way she expected. This wasn't to say she didn't feel pain, but more so, the pain was muted. It was as if it was being drowned out by another, more prominent feeling. Betrayal. She wasn't sure if she had ever experienced betrayal before, but the emotion filled up to the edges of her body, almost like an open wounding that had become infected. The fire that was burning all around her, burning the surface of her skin, was no match for that. In fact, she wished she could feel more of it, the flames. But instead, a deep aching took over her body and she could do nothing but lie still in the abyss of fire that engulfed her. She watched as the flames licked at her skin, already burning through her clothes, the anura, forming boils and blisters across her skin. In any other context, she'd be screaming, but she could only weep, her tears quickly turning to steam. She closed her eyes and an image popped up in her mind. It was the image of her uncle in the backyard staring straight at her, as if he could see her. As this image came to mind, she felt a piercing in her heart. The feeling of betrayal intensified. Was this what a broken heart felt like? A blister formed on her skin where the pain pierced through her chest the worst. The bump grew in size, becoming a shiny blister protruding from her rib cage. Images of her uncle flashed in her mind. Him helping her learn to walk. Him picking her up, spinning her around, him giving her a band-aid after she hurt herself, him telling stories with an alien mask on. One vision was a memory she had long forgotten. In it, she was about 15. She had just been removed from yet another artistic class by her parents, and to cheer her up, her uncle had a gift for her. He gave her a blue box and told her the gift inside was from far, far away. When she opened the box, there was a small, iridescent crystal. She picked it up to examine it. He told her to hold it close to her heart. He told her to feel the warmth of the crystal in her heart, as it had the power to connect her to the universe. And if she felt strongly enough, it had the power to create worlds. She remembered. On that day, her uncle had told her a story about Atlantis, about the rise and fall of the civilization, a story she had heard millions of times before. He had said the crystal was real and that he got it from there himself. At the time, she humored him. It was one of the very few moments that he was lucid, so she didn't try to correct him. She just nodded. The slideshow of memories faded into the fire. The boil grew larger and larger as more tears started to stream. The flames surrounding her started to shift colors. Instead of the hot, fiery orange, the flames turned brighter, a bluish color. Now, instead of the muted pain from the flames, she started to feel a prickly sensation throughout her body. The bump continued to grow as the visions of her uncle progressed through her child, teenage, and adult years, his cognitive ability gradually declining as she became more self-aware. Without warning, the boil popped, releasing an oily, dark matter into the blue flames. It spread everywhere, and as it became engulfed, she heard the substance sizzle. As the flames began to mix with the black substance, the flames turned a bright white, blindingly white. She tried closing her eyes once again, but they were stuck open. As the last of the blue vanished from around her to turn the brilliant shade of white, she noticed the wound in her chest where the boil burst was still open. The flames began to swirl together like the end of a tornado. As they swirled, they entered the opening in the center of her chest. Now, the flames were no longer piercing the outside of her skin. They were engulfing her from the inside. Her pupils turned white, glowing as bright as the fire that now raged inside her. She felt the urge to lift her hand, and as she did, she traced a circle in the air. This circle formed into a portal, but she couldn't make out what was on the other end. She was thrust through it anyway, stumbling through with fire writhing in her chest. This time, she awoke to the sound of a conversation. She was lying down on a platform, but when she opened her eyes, she couldn't see anything. It was completely black, but there were muffled voices not too far from her. She couldn't make out what they were saying, and she had no idea where they were coming from. She felt along the platform behind her. It was smooth and warm. Her hand brushed across something. She lost track of the object before grasping it in her hand. It was a wristband. Because she spent so much time reconstructing one, she knew it was the Portalese wristband that she was holding. She slipped it onto her wrist. She started flicking her hand, and a screen suddenly appeared in front of her. She tried flicking it again to create a portal, but the screen stayed. The other functions must have been disconnected. In front of her, the floating square screen widened, and she was able to see a scene displayed across its surface. There was a kitchen. It was the one inside her home. Her uncle and her mother were facing each other. She could tell by their tense stances that they had been fighting. It was surprising, seeing as her uncle usually didn't have much lucidity to argue, let alone stand up while doing it. She had never even seen her mother so furious. She looked visibly older. Still beautiful, as always, but older, like the weight of her daughter's absence had aged her tremendously. She had gray hairs everywhere now, wrinkles. She never thought she'd see the day when her mother looked older than her uncle. While she aged, he seemed to regress a bit. She still couldn't hear, but they had reached a point in their argument where they had both just stared at each other, silently. The screen abruptly changed to a new scene. It was of her uncle again. He was sitting in a wheelchair in a living room. When he had his tough days, he was kept in a wheelchair to keep him from hurting himself. He had a visitor. It was Ben, the friend that still worked at NASA. As Ben approached her uncle seemed to sit up a bit straighter. His eyes became more focused. Ben had also brought 2 other people with him. It seemed as if Ben was introducing the people to her uncle. She had only seen their backs. Something about them seemed familiar, though, but she didn't know why. One of them reached a hand out to shake her uncle's hand. Trembling slightly, her uncle returned the gesture, giving the guests a reluctant nod. As soon as the meeting had started, it ended. As the 3 people turned around, she instantly recognized the other 2 with Ben. She suddenly knew why she felt betrayed. Her uncle had met with the Canadian and the Russian, the astronauts that had stranded her. Why were they all meeting with each other? And why didn't she know about it? Could it have all been planned? No, of course not. With that realization, a light above her was turned on, and she noticed she was falling backward through a white void. The platform was no longer beneath her. Had she been falling the entire time? Below, she saw a staticky sea. She was plummeting toward it. As she loomed closer, the sea parted ways to reveal She woke up again. Once more, her body was numb, her ankles and wrists strapped to a hard table. She heard voices again. This time, she knew they were from the Narlips. She kept her eyes closed as they spoke in their original dialect. She had no idea what they could be saying, but she tried to control her breathing and steady her heartbeat. There was a silence as the Narlips scattered. She opened her eyes slightly to peer out. She noticed her chest was sliced open and there was a metal contraption protruding from her body. Her eyes grew wide and her heartbeat sped up. A nearby Narlip noticed the increased heart rate displayed across his monitoring screen, and before she could even get a word out, the Narlip pressed on the center of her forehead, knocking her out. She was outside her home, well, her human home, the home she had seen in the portal so long ago, that home. She was on the lawn, her lawn. She heard a plane flying by in the sky. Children were down the street playing. She felt a breeze on her skin. The sun was setting and the porch light turned on, just like before. She stared in awe at the sight before her. The Jeep in the driveway, the black shutters, the curtains drawn over the windows, and the light that was on just beyond them. She had missed this. She was finally back home. A sense of excitement welled up in her chest. She rushed to the front door. She raised her hand to knock, then reached into the pocket of the jeans she was wearing and pulled out a key. Her key. She unlocked the door and swung it open. She had never thought she'd miss opening a door, but suddenly a wave of gratitude washed over her. But soon, as she stepped into her home, the feeling of gratitude turned cold. At her feet was a pool of blood. It was bright, as if it hadn't been sitting for very long. She froze for a moment, staring down at the blood, knowing what it could mean. No. She rushed into the living room to find her mother slaughtered. She couldn't comprehend the details of the scene. She didn't understand why her mother's arms and torso were so far away from each other. She could feel nausea building up in her stomach. The smell was so intense. Iron. It was hot and humid. She heard her own voice ringing in her ears.
I didn't see anything, I promise.
Stumbling past the living room, she found her father's body in the kitchen. His disembodied hand was near the stove, holding a knife. The rest of him was everywhere else. She stopped, overwhelmed with emotion. She bent over to throw up, but nothing came out. Somehow, that was infinitely worse than if something did. Soon, her retching turned into dry heaving, then into painful sobs. All the strength in her body dissipated as she collapsed to the floor. There was blood all around her, soaking into her clothing. Was it her mother's? Her father's? A mixture of both? Her hands were bathed in it, but she dared not move. It was all she had left of them. She heard groaning. She turned around and headed in the direction of the sound. It was coming from upstairs. As she headed out, she noticed hexagonal etchings in a staircase. They were spread all over the walls. They hadn't been there before, when she had lived there. She looked around. Suddenly, she could see them everywhere. Hexagons across every surface in the home. And echoing into her head was another voice. K1's voice.
Prove to us you saw nothing, and it does not have to be this way.
She heard more groaning. Ignoring the voice, she ran upstairs, taking 2 at a time. The groans were coming from her room. As she opened the door, bracing herself for the inevitable onslaught, she stepped through and into another portal. Suddenly, she was no longer in her home. no longer in her room. The blood she had been soaked in was no longer clinging to her. She was now in the void again, the white void where it all began. She heard the ocean sound echoing, echoing, echoing around her. The black and white sea of white noise stretched all around her hexagon island platform. She fell down to its surface, her body drained of all fight, of all resistance. From above she heard a voice.
Now that we have your attention,
K1 said.
it is time to talk.
Hello again, my name is Michaela Simone Mack. I am the author, narrator, and producer of Creation Book of Portals and the entire Creation A Whole New Reality series. Thank you so very much for making it this far. This is episode 9, which means there is only one more left of this season. I am so excited for you to hear the last episode. And since this is the 9th episode, I would like to go ahead and reveal the name of the 3rd season that is coming up. So airing Friday, May 17th, is season 3 of Creation entitled Book of Life, a sphere that encompasses all matters of space and time. But of course, given the themes of these past 2 seasons, there's a twist and there's some horror. I hope that you have enjoyed this journey so far because I've loved writing, narrating, editing, putting this out. I love it. It's so exciting for me. Yes, I just thank you for joining my journey and being a part of it for so long. It has been, 19 episodes so far? Like, that's crazy. Thank you so much for listening. Yeah, so I'm excited for next week. Next week, Friday, is going to be the last episode of this season, and then we will be started back up with the new season, Season 3, Book of Life, on May 17th. Once again, thank you so much for listening. Please comment, share, subscribe. I'm trying to make it to at least 100 monthly listeners so that I can monetize this. That would be really great to reach that goal. Anyway, thank you so much. I hope you have a great day. See you and speak to you again next Friday for the finale. Bye-bye.